This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy podcast. I'm Brian Shrader, agronomist for the east side of the state of Indiana, joined as always by my co-host Ben Jacob from Southern Indiana. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning, Brian. How are you today?
Very good. I'm curious. We are recording on the 25th day of March. Curious if there is any field activity going on in your part of the world this week.
Field activity, yes. Planting, no. I'm reminded that Easter seems to be a pretty hard cutoff for us down here to put seeds in the ground. So we've got a little bit of a late Easter this year. So, there's nobody's getting too far ahead of themselves. I think as you go down south, down towards Evansville, there's definitely been some beans in the ground, but not a ton. A lot of gases went on. There was a little bit of tillage activity over the weekend here near my house, but for the most part, I think guys are staying put, and anything they are doing is just to shake a planter down.
Okay.
I'm assuming that similar case up north where you're at.
Yeah, we're a little bit behind. There's been a little bit of tillage, but it's mostly been, I think, waterway work or maybe gullies or things like that. I can't say that, at least in my travels over the last handful of days, late last week or over the weekend, that I've seen anybody really go to the field in earnest to do tillage at this point. And we're certainly, I would say, at least a week, maybe two, from any kind of sizable planting taking place.
Yeah, well, the difference from last year too, Brian, and this is important. I hope everybody's keeping this in mind, is that there's another week of Purdue basketball to watch that we wouldn't have had a year ago. So far the Boilermakers have met expectations.
There you go. Yeah, absolutely.
Made it to the Sweet 16 again. So at least one more week of basketball to keep people out of the field.
I think maybe the Boilers took their first round game just a bit more seriously this year than maybe what they did last year. And so, I mean, based on the score.
Yeah, I would say it's a fair assessment that they're there for business this year, and maturity helps for sure.
Yeah, it's for sure. Yeah, you bet. So, well, Ben, we mentioned that we're recording on the 25th day of March. We've still got some time, but I know that one of the things that you and I have talked about, and that continues to be a constant question from growers for us, is this idea of ideal soybean population. And certainly it looks like there's a good chance that we could go to the field a little bit earlier than what we typically think of, maybe very similar to what we did last year. I think there'll be some folks potentially go earlier this year than they did last year because they feel like they maybe missed out. And so we talk about soybean populations a lot and what the right number is, or how do I figure out what the right number is. And so I think that today maybe we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And I know this is something that you've given a lot of thought to over the last several years. So just kind of give us your ideas or synopsis on proper soybean populations.
Yeah, so I'll give my standard agronomist answer. It depends. There's a lot of variables that come into this, and I think where a lot of the ongoing conversation comes from is from guys that are planting practices have improved. Right, we're not doing the controlled spill with a drill anymore. Some guys are to the point where they either are considering a way to actually singulate beans and control their population a little better, and I think in some ways we're trying to apply what we've learned in corn to soybeans, even though the systems still aren't the same. So where I would start with, I think where I would want to start this conversation is, we're seeing soybean populations get pushed lower and lower. And while I do agree with some of that, I think we need to understand the risks associated with that, especially when what's one of the biggest indicators or correlations with high soybean yields is planting date. Well, we know if we're planting beans early, they're going to be in the less than ideal conditions, right? So I've heard it thrown out for the past couple of years that guys, at least in some areas, are dropping down below 100,000. And I will tell you that most of the people that I know that have done that have only done it for 1 year. And,
Sure.
and then we've gotten back to a more reasonable number. So for me, I your soybean seeding rate's going to change throughout the planting season. Early, you're going to need more. When we get into ideal conditions, you can probably back off a little bit, and then if we happen to get late, you're going to need more again. And Brian, you've heard me say it 1,000 times. I know you've said it as well, that we're really trying to manage for nodes per acre
Mm-hmm.
rather than
Yep.
plants per acre. Is that we need
Yep.
we need enough flowering locations for fruiting bodies, essentially. So with that in mind, it's going to be a moving target throughout the season. And with that managing for nodes per acre, if we're in more stressful environments, we need more plants
Yeah.
to prop up yield, right? So as a broad overview, without throwing a number out there, that's where I'm at. I mean, it's a moving target, and it's not one of those set it and forget it things. And I know you feel the same way as I do on planner setup, that we're not setting up or adjusting it throughout the season.
Yes.
So, if we want to throw a number out to average, I'm still 140 is where I want to be. And again, we can move around from that depending on the environment, but
Yeah.
just as a starting point, I'd stick at 140. I'm
Sure.
curious where you're at moving north. There is some evidence. Sorry, before we get that, there is some evidence that you know soybean populations, particularly in stressful environments, um, respond more as you go north than they do as you go south with the shorter
Yeah.
growing season and there's more light available, right? So
Right. Yeah. I don't have a number. I have traditionally kind of given a range. Um, your number's probably on the lower end of my range, I would say. I tend to say 140 to 150. A lot of that has to do with the variability that I see in my soils as well. But I do think that over the last handful of years, specifically for me, that number has started to come down because we've had such issues with white mold over the last 3 or 4 years, let's say, in my geography, that I've actually seen a number come quite a bit down. I think planting systems obviously have impacted that as well. But I also think the other piece of that we can get into a little bit, I think it probably warrants its own podcast, honestly, but seed treatment has helped in my part of the world as well in order to bring that number down. When we were planting, and when I remember in my career, 220,000 was not uncommon when it was controlled spillage, like you talked about with a drill. I remember those numbers. I remember doing that arithmetic on how much seed a guy needed. But we were doing that for weed control issues. We were doing that because we knew that we were going to lose a lot of our stand because of disease and some of those things. And so I think seed treatment is another piece of this that kind of goes into your planning practice improvement as well. That's brought that number down for me. But, if I've got to pick one number, it's probably going to be 145, but my range is probably 140 to 150 on average for a good chunk of my territory. Still working with some guys to get them to that number, to be real fair. There's a comfort level that comes from this and a visual cue that a field that's seeded at a correct rate, quote unquote, has a certain eye appeal that guys really like. And so that's part of, I think, what plays into this number as well.
yeah, so you mentioned seeding rates, and I think that's seed treatments, and I think that's a good call out. Um, and I would say that not all seed treatments are created equal, and not all genetics are created equal. So when you think about things like Phytophthora, or Pythium, or any of these seedling blights, variety to variety, their tolerance to that is not going to be the same.
Right.
Now, nothing is perfect, so you can expect some level of attrition, right? And I think that's where the disconnect comes in sometimes. Is when we look at a cornfield, we could say we get everything up in uniform and it's up to V3. We feel pretty confident that those uniform plants, that every one of them is going to make it to harvest and produce an ear. and that's not the case in soybeans. And so I'm I'm an agronomist, right? So you're going to have to bear with me on my math estimates. But if our bag of seed is labeled at 90% germ, and we go plant 140,000, and so say 90% of them do germinate, we're going to get roughly 126,000 of them out of the ground, or germinate, excuse me, just germinated. Now, in your experience in northeastern Indiana, I'm sure you can have a guesstimate, but germinated does not mean emerged, right? It does not mean that's going to come out of the ground.
That's
So
absolutely right.
if we say we're going to, there's 10% attrition even from germination to emergence, that drops us down from 126,000 to 113 and change. And there's some amount of attrition throughout the season. Right. So is that 10%? Is that 15%? Is it 5%? I don't know, but for the sake of argument, we'll call it 10. And that gets our 140,000 planting rate to a harvest stand down around 100,000. Okay. So it's real easy to see. And I think those are reasonable estimates that you're going to lose 10% at, germination, emergence, and then throughout the growing season, that there'll be
Sure.
some degree of thinning. And if we have any sort of additional stress on top of that, a higher disease pressure year, or a wet, cold, dry, hot, whatever that might be, you those numbers could be higher than that. But you can easily see that if you're getting down to 130,000, 120,000, 115,000, that all of a sudden it would be pretty easy for you to have um, well, a less than optimum stand, to say the least, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's not a big stretch at all to make. So,
Yeah. Well, and spacing plays a big part in this as well when you carry those stands out to yield in the fall. For years, kind of the gold standard that was thrown out was this idea of 80,000. This comes from Dr. Jim Berline's data from years ago at Ohio State. I know Dr. Castile has done some stuff in Indiana here more recently, kind of updating that number a little bit. But a lot of that, we've got to remember those numbers that get thrown out when we talk about replant decisions or a minimum stand for optimum yield type of discussion. Those are evenly spaced. And so that's the issue that we run into on this lower end as well, Ben. That's why, frankly, am such a big fan of variable rate soybean seeding, is because of that. But we can get into that a little bit later. But I think we want to be very careful that there is a stand quality measurement that is part of this as well, not just a number.
yeah,
And so just something from my experience up here, knowing what we know about replant and some of those things was worth mentioning as well.
yeah, I agree with that. And I think replant decisions are either really easy or they suck, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Right. So I think the cost associated with that, I get that markets are tight, right? Profitability is tight this year, but look at the benefit, the exchange. If we are planting, let's just say we're planting our beans on April 15th. It's a reasonable planting date, and we decide to cut our rate back by 10 or 15,000 or whatever that might be. The beans that survive, they're not going to grow fast. We're probably going to be fairly cool, and so when you look at the timeline for replant decisions, 2 weeks minimum, three
Yep,
weeks
probably.
more, or
Yeah,
they come
depends a
up,
little bit.
and then we look at them for 10 days and argue, or well, are there more coming, or is this, and then we end up losing 3 or 4 weeks of the season before we decide to go in and replant, and then
Yeah.
do we just try and thicken it up a little bit? Do we start over?
Yeah.
So, and I bring that up just to reiterate where we were at earlier, is that the planting date is correlated stronger than anything else with soybean yield. Right? And
Yep.
we know that, and earlier planted beans yield. So if we give up a little bit on seeding rate and increase the risk that we're going to have to replant, And we know in the state of Indiana, there are going to be replant bean fields every year. And
Yep.
that's just part of the ground that we farm,
Yep.
and pushing that planting date. So, how much yield are you giving up by, or how much yield are you risking rather by drawing that back just a little bit? So I think there needs to be a balance in there that, yeah, we need to have our balance sheet look right on from the seeding rate standpoint, but also understand the risk if we dip down just a little bit too low. And your comment on uniformity, I know this isn't as important as it was with a drill and with some of the herbicide technology we have now, but man, getting that canopy to close as quick as you can, one, to help with sunlight interception and optimize the bean, but two,
Right.
just for weed control. And
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if we've talked about what you saw up there this last June, but I mean, we were so dry, beans took
Hmm.
forever to canopy,
Yeah.
and our residuals ran out, so we had some pressure
Right.
where we otherwise wouldn't. And I think that was exacerbated by some of the marginal stands we had in a lot of
Yeah.
areas.
Now the one thing I will say about that, at least in my experience, and I don't have any data necessarily to quote, so this is just strictly Brian Shrader's experience, Ben. The difference in canopy date of a stand of 100 and let's say 50,000, let's use my number, versus let's say that 200,000 or 180, even a little bit more realistic number at this point on the high end. We're not talking about several weeks. We're talking about days, even under those stressful conditions that you're talking about. Now, can those days make a difference, especially if we're at the end of our residual like you talked about? They certainly can. But I don't want any of our listeners to think that the difference between canopying a stand of 150,000 and standing a stand of 180,000 is going to be 2 weeks. It's probably not going to be that long, but there is something to getting the canopy closed sooner, and there is a balancing point there between population and canopy closure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good call out. And because I think that in the days of a drill, it was probably more important that having enough beans out there, because you weren't bridging out
Yeah,
across the row quite so much.
yeah,
But it is impactful. So
sure.
I mean, Ryan, you mentioned VRS and some
Hmm.
of the variability you have in your ground out there. So, let's just say a scenario, you're you're planting beans across some variable ground that's common in your area
Yeah.
on May 1st. What sort of ranges are we looking at for population across those
Yeah.
environments?
Yeah. So I will start here. My own personal preferences is I think that when you make a VRS prescription for soybeans, the absolute minimum that you should vary between your rates would be 5,000. And typically I typically do 10,000. Depending on the complexity of the grower. A lot of times we'll start at that midpoint. So, looking to try to average someplace around 150,000, and then you'll go 140 and you'll go 160 in a lot of cases on either side. I do have some growers that prefer to have four. And so we'll basically go from 140 in their best ground, and then we'll go probably 170 or 175. A few that come to mind that maybe even 180 on the toughest soil, if you will, the most challenging environments where we tend to have stand issues chronically, just trying to negate some of that attrition that you talked about just by putting more seeds out there. So probably, let's say 140 to 170 is probably a pretty good range for a lot of guys in my geography, Ben.
Yeah, I would be right around the same seeding rates. I think I'll make a statement here that I'm sure some people are going to disagree with pretty fervently, but I do not believe that you should ever plant beans the way things stand today, ever plant beans below 130,000.
Okay.
At least I don't have any
Okay.
environments that I feel confident that that's gonna consistently provide a positive outcome.
Sure.
As genetics and seed treatments and technology change, maybe I'll shift more and get on the future. On the
Yep.
on the high end of that rate, some of our melon sand, I might push up 190, but it's going to be real tough ground. And then you have the calculation in there to make. Well, best case scenario, if we catch a couple of good rains, these are going to be 55 bushel beans.
Yeah.
Otherwise they're going to burn up. So is it really worth pushing them up that high?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I, the other thing too that we got, the sand comes to mind mostly as the stress ground, but we've got some real heavy ground too, that some clays that we know that. And I know you've got more of that up there. I wonder how the soil type just in general outside of, because you can grow real good corn on some clay, but
Yeah.
does the soil type play into any consideration when you're thinking about seeding rates?
I think it probably does a little bit, but it's probably more from the standpoint of drainage,
Yeah.
quite honestly. Those clay soils that have, high water holding capacity that maybe aren't artificially drained well, we're going to hedge on a higher seeding population to try to keep from losing too much and then having to come back, wherever that floor is that I set, you set, or the grower sets. We want to try to not get to that. And so we'll hedge our bets a little bit by trying to seed a little bit higher. I don't know that I necessarily have a percentage number, but
Yeah.
that's kind of how we do it with our clay soils. Those will always be the higher seeding rate compared to more of the loamy or siltier thing, that we have. And I don't have a lot of sand. That's, probably more Carl, that would be dealing with that. But, that's, for us, the loamier, type siltier soils, those are the ones where we're really pushing that 130 limit, like you were talking about in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess the other thing that would come into that is, within the seeding rate conversation is what sort of tillage system are we operating? Or I've got quite a bit of ground that's in cover crops. Um, there are Hendricks and Putnam County. We've got a pretty good strip of cover crops through there, and the long and the short of it is for me is that the more residue you have, the more moisture you're going to hold. The colder the ground's going to say, the more population you need
Right.
to
Yeah.
to get the,
No.
the stand
Yeah,
that you
I
want.
would definitely agree with that. I've got some growers that do a lot of uh, either soybeans back to beans, or even a handful that, just because of the way their operation runs, they've got some farms that are just continuous soybeans. So you don't have quite as much of the residue that you're talking about, but you do have some of the challenges because it's continuous soybeans there, that, you talk about with those cooler, wetter soils, different reasons for it, but similar issues. And so you got to be a little careful with population there too, just to ensure that that attrition doesn't get too high.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think with all the no-till, um, you know, that residue cover can just be a bear to plant through
Right.
sometimes, and
Yep.
you're going to
Yeah.
introduce variability. A number of those seeds aren't even going to make it into the ground.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
obviously we need more population there. Excuse me. The other thing that comes up with that, and we've seen it more years than not here recently, is insect feeding. Slugs, I guess, aren't
Yeah.
technically insects, but seed corn maggot and slugs down here in
Yep.
pockets have hammered pretty hard. And especially early planting when it's cold and the beans can't outgrow that pressure. So all these things coming together to make up what your seeding rate should be. But the bottom line is, each time you encounter one of these adverse conditions, you need more seeds planted to
Yes.
to help overcome that.
Yep.
Right. So if we can, if we can kind of wrap up, this has been a little bit of a meandering conversation, I think, but to bring it all back in, your seeding rates are going to vary based on where you're at and the kind of ground you're at. Um, the more stress you're going to see from the type of ground that you're on, the slower growth rate those beans are going to have, and I'm thinking drought stress primarily. You need to add population for that.
Yeah.
Stress from early planting, cold weather, water. So if we're starting early, like you mentioned as we kicked off, we're late March here. Guys are going to get pretty antsy soon. We need more population to overcome whatever early season stresses we're going to see. As planting progresses, you can draw that back down when we have more ideal planting conditions. But as we get late, we need to add population back to add more nodes
Yeah.
to add more flowering points to that field. On top of that, looking at the environment, the conditions, your tillage system, what sort of residue, do you have a history of these seedling diseases or insect or slug pressure? You need to add population for all of that, right?
Yeah.
So, this has been a lot of words to say, Brian. Where I started out, soybean seeding rate, it really depends. But I think the key point for me that guys to take away is that seeding rate does not equal harvest stand. And there is a huge gulf between what those two numbers are. And
Absolutely.
it's not what the germination rate is on the bag either.
Right.
So, the attrition is a lot higher than that. And I think that the cost savings of drawing seeding rate down too much does not balance out the risk of doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. The only thing that I will add to this, Ben, we've talked about it, but I want to explicitly pull this out. I am a firm believer that if you are planting soybeans in Indiana, they should be treated. I don't think there's any time during the season when you can say, "Nah, I'm done. It's late. I think I don't need it anymore." If you're planting a soybean, it is my belief that it needs to be treated of some kind. And so you can certainly take that into your calculation that you talked about, but it needs to be a constant. They just need to be treated. And I think if I didn't mention that, I'd feel bad about that once we got done with our recording. So
No, I agree 100%. And I would add to that you should probably know what's in your treatment. If your seed
yes.
provider can't tell you what's in your treatment and what it is doing, I
Yeah.
would I would approach that with a degree of skepticism. Would we say, is that a fair way to put
Yes.
it?
I think that's a
So
great way of putting it. Yes. Yeah,
yeah.
for sure.
So yeah, it's a nuanced conversation, right? No two growers and two fields are going to get the same answer. I would reiterate, I know I brought it up once, that for me the bare minimum threshold is 130,000. Like I get real nervous if I see anything dip, and that is in good ground on good conditions with good drainage. We're going to
Yeah.
get we're they're set up for most of those seeds to be successful.
Sure. And I'll add the top end. I think that if you're up over 180,000, I think you've got some real questions to ask yourself why you're that high. It may be justified, I will say that, but I think that if your average is up over 180,000 and you're in 15s or 20s, we need to look at that and make sure, talk to your local Pioneer rep or your agronomist and make sure that really is what makes sense. We love to sell beans, Ben, but we want to sell them for the right reason. And so that's, I think that gap that we've given you, there's a lot of wiggle room there from 130 to 185. But you make sure that you talk with your local Pioneer sales rep or your local agronomist, and make sure that those numbers are right for your acres, because, even within my geography, not everybody's planting the exact same thing because of tillage practices, weed control, all the things that we've talked about. And so there's always going to be a range to soybeans. It's not quite as definable perhaps as what corn populations can be.
Yep,
Yep.
absolutely. I agree. And there's different equipment. There are different row spacing. There's just more variables to it, right?
Absolutely.
It's a different system. So,
Yeah, for sure.
make and make make sure you're making the right decisions for your farm and what you're planting that day and the ground that you're on. Again, I'd reiterate, this is not a set it and forget it kind of
Right.
conversation to have the best outcome.
Yeah. Yeah. You shouldn't probably be, well, you should not probably, you should not be planning the same rate on the very first day that you are the last day, unless your planning window is incredibly tight. If it's a couple days, maybe a week perhaps, but if your planning window is going to be much longer than that, there needs to be some adjustment throughout that season, as Ben's talked about this morning. So that's where I think we probably can leave it, Ben. Like you say, a nuanced conversation. We probably just hit the high points. But if somebody did hear something from you that they are interested in maybe learning a little bit more, how can they reach out to you?
Yep, you can find me on Twitter at the Ben Jacob and occasionally on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy. How about you, Brian?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at B_K_Shrader. With that, we thank you for joining us. We hope that as your spring gets started, that you're safe. If you've ever got any questions about anything we talked on about on the podcast, be sure to reach out to us, and we will be talking to you next week.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.